Hi, good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining us for a POGO town hall on corruption and the public interest. We are very glad to have you with us today, and this is going to be a wonderful event with a truly incredible lineup of speakers. My name is Dylan Hedtler-Gaudette. I am the Government Affairs Manager with the Project on Government Oversight. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce all of you to our keynote guest today. She is the representative from the 7th District of Virginia. She's in her second term as a member of Congress. She was originally voted in the 2018 midterms, and since then she has developed a reputation as a serious, hardworking, no-nonsense member of Congress, which, to be honest, happens to be my favorite kind of member of Congress. I will admit to that up front, to being a bit of a fanboy. But that notwithstanding, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger from the 7th District will be our keynote speaker today. And part of the reason why we have asked Congresswoman Spanberger to join us and why she's been so generous with her time to do so is because she is the lead sponsor of a very important piece of legislation that we have been privileged to work with her and her staff on. It is called the Trust in Congress Act, and it is designed to address a particularly pernicious problem that the public cares a lot about, and that is the real and perceived problem of financial conflicts of interest of members of Congress, and with insider trading in particular. So with that, I will hand it off to the Congresswoman, and we can get things started.
Thank you so much, Dylan, and thank you to POGO for organizing this fantastic event. And thank you for your support of our Bipartisan Trust in Congress Act. One of the things that you said in your introduction, Dylan, that I really appreciated was you said real and perceived. And I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I think that's a really important element of why I introduced this legislation and why I'm such a strong advocate for aggressively pursuing opportunities to provide transparency and accountability, even in cases where they may not be fully necessary. I think being proactive in this space is incredibly important. Over the past few years, I have been very proud to partner with POGO as we work to increase transparency and accountability throughout our federal government. And I am very hopeful that we can really work together. And certainly I thank everyone for joining in this broadcast today. And I hope you'll join us in really working together to restore the American people's faith in our democratic institutions, and to recognize that we all as citizens have the opportunity and the responsibility to hold our elected officials, our government officials to account, and really work to restore some of the faith that's been eroded in our nation's institutions. So to all of the good government advocates and experts who are joining us here today, thank you so much for the work that you do. My name is Abigail Spanberger, and I represent Virginia's 7th Congressional District, and it is home to Virginians who span the political spectrum with a diverse range of views and a diverse range of priorities and political ideologies. And when I first started running for Congress back in 2017, it was clear to me that there were challenges related to political polarization. But there's also challenges related to just trust that existed in our district. So, and over again, I would hear questions about, choices, whether or not you take corporate PAC money or you don't. And if you do, from which companies? As an example for me, it was an easy step for me to say, okay, well, I'm not going to take corporate PAC money because there seems to be an element here where people are perceiving something, some sort of motivation or engagement that makes them have some doubt in their elected representatives. And some of these questions that seem to doubt people's intentions or doubt people's efforts to truly represent their constituents, it didn't belong to a particular political party. People who identified as Democrats had a basic level of doubt in Congress or in elected officials, and people who identified as Republicans had the same tendencies. And it's not that there weren't other issues that were impacting people's day-to-day, ranging from prescription drug costs to the lack of broadband internet access, which is a major issue in my district. But it was this kind of general idea that perhaps neither of these problems, or none of the problems that matter, we're really going to see progress because in their eyes, did lawmakers really care about them? Did their voices really matter? Was there really kind of a point in engaging in the system? And I think that in the face of this suspicion, in the face of this confusion about, why would someone run? Who are they representing? I don't know. Everything's broken. Do I actually believe in Congress? This sense that things just aren't working keeps people out of the political process. And it makes it so that people don't think that there's a place for them or for their voices in politics. And that, I think, is deeply, deeply problematic for our democracy. And so since arriving in the House of Representatives, I've really made it a priority to reiterate what I believe it should be and is to be an elected official, and what it means to represent a community, and indeed the community of my neighbors and people who live near me and other Virginians. Representing my constituents in the halls of Congress means that I'm accountable to my constituents. It means I need to communicate with my constituents. It means I need to explain myself to my constituents. And since I was first sworn in January of 2019, I've tried to do these things, to be transparent, to be accessible, and to be accountable by holding as many town halls and forums as I've been able to, hearing directly from community members. Of course, before the pandemic, in person, and since the pandemic, on telephone town halls and on virtual town halls. I have a robust newsletter that we send out every single week so people know what it is that I've been working on. We keep a calendar online so people know, what I'm doing day to day. And this is about ensuring that people know what I'm doing on their behalf, why I'm doing it on their behalf, and frankly, what we're achieving on behalf of the people across Central Virginia. So in addition to reestablishing this notion of what a member of Congress should be doing and is doing and being accountable on the legislative front, I think it's incredibly important that lawmakers recognize the need to restore faith in lawmakers as people and restore some level of trust in government overall. And that's where I really like the comment that Dylan made about perceived or real. I'm the oldest of three sisters. And when I was younger and would have some sort of argument with my sisters, my mother would always say, their perception is their reality. So my sisters would complain that I had aggrieved them in some way, and I sought to defend myself. And my mother said, well, their perception is their reality. And this is a notion that I have carried through to the halls of Congress, that when people are perceiving that there are misdeeds by members of Congress, it isn't enough to say, no, this isn't, there isn't corruption here, or this isn't a problem. We have to go above and beyond, recognize that their perception has become their reality, and that perception is detrimental to our democracy. And so we have to take a step above and beyond to not only ensure that we are stamping out any possible avenues for corruption or actual misdeeds, but we actually need to work harder to reduce even the possibility for perception that members of Congress, might be self-dealing or self-serving. And we do that by raising our standards and recognizing that we hold a very unique position of trust in our democracy. And certainly that issue of perception was particularly evident last year. I'm sure all of you remember that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, Americans saw so many news reports about how United States senators were allegedly abusing their access to information related to the COVID-19 pandemic. They were buying and selling stocks, cleaning supplies and medical equipment in pharmaceutical companies before the public was really aware of how severe this crisis was going to be. And the perception, of course, or the circumstance at the time was that they're doing this while in a time of crisis, they're doing this self-dealing, preparing for the pandemic, and as their constituents did not necessarily know what was about to come. And Americans were rightly appalled. And as we know through the investigations, these apparent or perceived violations of public trust didn't amount to anything in terms of legal action. All of the individuals involved were pretty much exonerated of having done anything highly unethical. But honestly, for me, the damage was done, because here we had a circumstance where, whether intended or not, the American public saw incidents of lawmakers taking an action that was perceived as helping them and and doing so at a time when it was the constituents who needed help. So even if there had been nothing done in the eyes of the law, the perception that there was insider trading or backroom deals, that perception is detrimental to the health and the future of our democracy. And the sort of pervasive, yep, they're at it again, or how unsurprising, or of course they're doing that. They're trading Clorox or this or that. That in and of itself is problematic. And frankly, I don't fault the American people for having these concerns, for having these perceptions, and so it is absolutely the reason why we need to go a step above and beyond to say, indeed, we want to remove all opportunity for even perception of misdeed or a reason to not be trusted. And so for me, the question was, well, how can you build back this trust? How can you remove even the opportunity for a perception, let alone the reality that a member of Congress is not holding themselves to the highest ethical standard? And in this case, it became pretty straightforward that the Trust in Congress Act could make a difference. So our bill is very straightforward. And I think it's gotten a fair amount of attention because following these news stories related to the COVID-19 crisis and stock sales, the idea that our bill would say all members of Congress, so members of the House, members of the Senate, as well as their spouses and their dependent children, that if you have individual stocks, you can put it in a qualified blind trust as soon as you enter Congress, or you could sell it. And that these assets would stay in a blind trust for the entirety of their time on Capitol Hill. And while some may say like, oh, that's a hurdle, that's a challenge. Well, there's already a bunch of hurdles and challenges that one endures when you decide to run for Congress in the first place. And so for me, taking the step of saying, I'm not going to hold individual stock, or if I do, I'm going to roll it all into a blind trust, or I'm, only going to do, invest in my retirement and make it very clear that I'm not, day trading stocks that could potentially be informed by information I have access to as a member of Congress. This would be a new firewall between members of Congress and their investments, and it would really give us a new tool in not only preventing leaders from using their positions of power to unethically inform their investment decisions or influence the value of investments they already have, but it will actually ensure that even the perception that that's a possibility is gone. And since the focus of this event is on corruption, I do think it's important to point out that the Trust in Congress Act would help reduce the opportunities for corruption on Capitol Hill while strengthening the public's confidence in our democratic, lowercase d, democratic representation. And frankly, tackling corruption and restoring the faith that voters have in their elected officials should not be a partisan issue. And I have been very encouraged to see that our bill has received a wide range of support from lawmakers and government accountability organizations across the political spectrum. And the Trust in Congress Act is directly in line with what brought me to Congress in the first place. That's to work on behalf of the people across Central Virginia, find bipartisan solutions that can strengthen our democracy, increase government accountability, and serve the people of our community and this country. And so I'm really grateful that POGO has been so vocal in their support of this bill. I am appreciative of the opportunity to join you all today, and I look forward to working with so many of you in the future as we really work to advance the best interests of those that people like me represent, and that's the American people and the citizens of this country. So thank you so very much for including me today. And Dylan, I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Spanberger. I hope after hearing you speak so eloquently on these issues, I hope the audience can understand why I often refer to you as one of my favorite members of Congress, and not just on this issue, but on a range of issues. And just to let everyone know, we will be starting a bit of a Q&A where I will be asking some questions of the Congresswoman, and some of these questions are derived, or they're sort of amalgamations of questions that we received from the audience in advance of this event. So I just want to, at the outset, thank those of you who submitted questions. There were some really good ones, and in the interest of trying to get everyone's perspectives sort of here and included in this event, we wanted to kind of add them together to form some broader question to get at the points you all were asking about. So But I will start with a question, Congresswoman. I hope you don't mind. I am aware of your, and I think a lot of people are aware of your sort of unique background before you came to Congress. You were a part of the intelligence community, specifically at the CIA. And I was wondering if in that role, which is of course a role where you have to know a lot about other societies, other cultures, other countries, and the politics of those places. I'm wondering if in your role in the intelligence community, you learned some things, you saw some things related to corruption, related to public trust that you brought with you back here, and that informed the way you do your job as a member of Congress, but also that informed your interest in working in this particular issue space and on this particular bill.
So the broad brush answer to your question is yes, but perhaps for reasons beyond just what I saw or witnessed, or some of the challenges that face other countries in terms of more prevalent corruption or very sort of clear acceptance of corrupt behaviors. And that is in my time as a CIA case officer. I was undercover for the entirety of my time with the agency. I was a case officer, which meant I was recruiting and handling foreign individuals who were committing espionage on behalf of the United States to help inform our policymakers, to help keep our country safe. And what that meant is that I was usually operating by myself. And some of this is highlighted some in the kind of Hollywood versions of this, but at the end of the day, I was going out to meet a foreign asset. I was out on my own. I was bringing money, typically significant sums of money, and I was meeting one-on-one. And so not only was I responsible for taxpayer dollars, but I was responsible for the information that I was collecting. And there were no witnesses, there were no recordings, there was nobody else to validate that what I came back to our station, to our office and reported was indeed what was happening, or what was, a true accounting of what the foreign asset had told me. And so in this position, you have to do everything possible to ensure that you are demonstrating the utmost ethical behavior, because at the end of the day, your ability to do your job depends on people trusting you. Your ability to do the job requires that any amount of money that you may be holding, carrying, and handing to an asset to which they put an X on a piece of paper, that you are fully trusted, that you have executed the operational activities as you said you would, and then as you later attest to, and that every bit of information, be it about something great national security interests, that's timely and informative, that might inform direct actions of the U.S. government, to even smaller elements that or bits of information that help form an opinion that we might have of a particular foreign leader or a particular event or circumstance, that information has to be conveyed 100% accurately. And so it's my experience as a case officer, knowing that I had to demonstrate the utmost ethical behavior every single minute that I was kind of out and about operationally, is what I think helped inform how I function in Congress, because you can never, ever give even a reason to doubt the ethical behavior that you demonstrate. And I think, to your point, Dylan, when you're engaging with other countries that might have different different acceptance levels of corruption, they're also then looking for places where they think that you might not be of the utmost ethical kind of standard. And so demonstrating outwardly every step of the way that you are the most ethical person, and that you are completely driven by and focused on your obligation to the United States, that makes it sure that you can do your job well and also not be targeted by other foreign governments.
Clear that trust is the through line through all of this, all of what we're talking about here, in government corruption, a public faith in institutions. It sounds like trust is really a North Star for you, which I think is a great characteristic in an elected official, to be sure. One other question I wanted to ask, and this also reflects some audience questions and interest they have. A lot of folks don't really know kind of behind the curtain what the process would be, or a member of Congress like you who have decided they have this idea they want to run with, but then they have to start talking to some of their colleagues, right? You have to start talking to some of the people you work with who may be from the same party, they may be across the aisle, but you have to start socializing the idea, and then you have to start trying to get people to buy in with you and to potentially co-sponsor. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about what that process was like around this bill in particular. And of course, I'm not asking you to divulge any specific conversations with specific people you had, of course. I think broad strokes will do fine for this question, but I think there are a lot of folks who would be curious to know sort of how that process works.
Well, absolutely. And I will name names on this one because I do think it speaks to how bipartisan the issue of trying to establish trust can be. So I was talking to a counterpart from Texas, Representative Chip Roy. And for those of you who may follow politics closely, Chip Roy and I disagree on almost everything. But we're both UVA graduates. And so we frequently will greet each other and talk about the happenings of the day, particularly as it relates to UVA sports. And so in the early days of COVID, he and I were talking as there were all of these swirling accounts of this person sold this stock and this person bought this stock. And he and I were speaking very kind of frankly about how bad it is that not only these allegations are there because of actions that members of Congress or members of the Senate had taken, but indeed that the American people just said, yeah, that checks out. That's the Congress we know. The idea that in the middle of a global pandemic that people would just accept that there was self-dealing. And so that, that was one thing that we could agree on. And again, we find ourselves in very different places, politically speaking. But we started to get to work on this idea. And so I said, this is something I really want to pursue. Do you want to pursue it with me? And so we looked at, how can we make reasonable steps forward, recognizing that it's not just about the member of Congress. It's also about their spouses. It's also about their dependent children. It's about ensuring that a household isn't able to even give off the perception of benefiting from the office that we are elected to serve in and benefiting from the role that we have relative to our constituents. And so set forth, writing out the legislation, talking through, okay, so, if you have a TSP account, which is if you're a federal employee or government savings account, or if you have a 401k, well, you don't have the day-to-day ability to trade based on what might be world occurrences. So, those sorts of funds, that's acceptable, right? We don't want to preclude people from being able to save for their retirement, but it's the individual stocks. I sold this, or I bought this, or so-and-so sold this or bought this. That's the real problem. And again, some people had prior lives where, because of what they were doing, they did have individual stocks. That's fine. Put it in a blind trust, right? And you don't know if the people handling your blind trust sell it, keep it. You don't know. It's out of sight, out of mind. And it's there in whatever form when you're done with your government service. And so, Chip and I introduced this legislation, and I just started talking to people about it. And frankly, there's a lot of members of Congress who have stocks. And so it is kind of a big deal to start to say, I want you to put all of your money into a blind trust. In fact, I want to impede your family's ability to buy and sell stocks. And so it isn't something that is universally beloved as an idea, because it is going to have an immediate impact on many members of Congress's lives, because of the fact that many people own individual stocks. And so for me, in kind of lobbying my colleagues on this bill, I really position it as an issue where we can take affirmative action to demonstrate that we want to ensure that not only are we behaving and conducting ourselves in the most ethical of ways, but indeed we are willing to go an additional step to remove any type of potential perception that we might, be doing otherwise. And so we've been able to gather co-sponsors in that way. And it's, we're slugging along, and I appreciate, events like this to be able to highlight it as a priority for our office, certainly a piece of legislation that POGO and other transparency and accountability related organizations support. And I hope that more people will bring it to their members of Congress and ask that they join this effort to affirm that we're willing to take an extra step to show that indeed, we don't even want the perception that there could be any type of personally motivated financial transactions being undertaken by members of Congress or their families or spouses or dependent children.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's wonderful that, and this is one of the things that you've made a name for, you work with people, you meet people where they are, and you will work with people to get things done, irrespective of whether you agree with them on everything else, which I think is a really good and common sense, practical way to go about the business of governing. I think this is a prime example of that. So I think I'll end here because we've got a wonderful panel that I know we want to get to. But one last question I have for you, Congresswoman Spanberger, is what do you think the prospects are for maybe getting this bill through and signed into law? And relatedly, what can we do as the public, as civil society organizations, as people who care about these issues? What can we do to help you in your mission to get this kind of thing done and to restore faith and trust in the government?
Well, I think that there's a bit of an uphill path towards getting this legislation signed into law, and primarily because there is legislation that prohibits, and this is actually sadly only more recently that prohibits members of Congress from using insider information to be able to purchase stocks or make stock trades. And so I think that in the context where many people will say it's illegal, it's already illegal, we can't self-deal, it's illegal, that to take that step and say, yes, it's illegal, yes, I'm not doing it, you're clearly asserting you're not doing it, but this is not about not self-dealing, it's about ensuring that the American people know that we're not. It's about removing any doubt. It's about removing any reason that people think that they should, politicians, right? It's about taking an additional step that might be aggravating or hard or financially complicated, for those who have large amounts of stock holdings, to say, I'm taking this extra step because I think it's important. I think it's important that I affirm to you that I'm, definitely not making any financially motivated or self-interested decisions. And so, for those organizations who might be doing advocacy, for the individuals who might want to do advocacy, I would just sort of recommend that it is not necessarily about the reality of potential corruption, right? Because we have laws that stop the reality of corruption. It's against the law. So either someone chooses to break the law or they don't. This is about taking that additional step to make it harder, to make illegal acts actually that much harder, but most importantly, to restore trust and accountability by saying we're not even going to make it possible. And so for any of the advocates who might be bringing this legislation to the congressional offices in the states where you live, I would recommend that, you really raise it as an issue of this is about affirming that the American people can trust members of Congress. And it's a real tangible way for Congress to do that. And I think, when I have made that argument, it's made a lot of sense to people. And so I'm going to continue working. I think we've got a bit of an uphill climb because it again, for those who think, I'm holding myself to the highest ethical standard, why is this necessary? It's getting to that next step of saying, but it's about making sure that people know that you are removing all possibility. It's about making sure that people know that you are so committed to ethical behavior that you're willing to take this step of limiting the types of stock investments that you're able to make, or that you're willing to, move your money into a blind trust. And so that, for me, I think is, those are the more convincing angles when working to get co-sponsorship. But I'm going to keep pushing for it because I think this legislation is really important. It's important as across the board, people have less and less faith in our system. We should be taking proactive steps to affirm that indeed people who are serving in elected office not only are accountable, but want to be, and will take the extra steps to demonstrate that.
Absolutely. I think that makes all the sense in the world. So to everyone watching, reach out to your members of Congress, encourage them to co-sponsor the Trust in Congress Act. And if you need any help with any of that process, there are plenty of resources out there, and POGO is always here to help. So thank you so much, Congresswoman Spanberger, both for joining us today, but even more importantly for being such a leader on these issues broadly around anti-corruption and good government, but also on the Trust in Congress Act in particular.
Thank you so very much.
And from here, I will be handing it off to my colleague, Zoe Ryder, to moderate our wonderful expert panel.
Thanks, Dylan. That was a really great conversation and a great way to kick off the next panel. And very happy to have that advice on how we can engage our POGO supporters to be strong advocates on this legislation. So I'm going to put, Dylan's going to step off screen, and we're going to bring up our panelists for the next session. I just want to, before I introduce our fantastic panelists, I'm just going to do a quick tour of the crowdcast functionality. You can leave messages in chat as you wish. Those are seen by everyone. This session is recorded and will be distributed. And if you want to ask a question, we have this nifty little function down below in the bottom called Ask a Question. And you can sort of upvote people's questions. So if there's someone who's asking a question that you think is great and you definitely want to ask, feel free to vote for it, and it'll help us. I'm really hoping we get some time for audience questions towards the end. I will make sure of that. We might go maximum 5 minutes over, but no more. And before we do that, I also want to point out to this little green button, right sort of in the middle of Walt's in my head. Become a POGO advocate means working with folks like Walt, Shaub, myself, and all of our advocates to really push for increasing political pressure on our elected officials to pass the laws and the reforms that we really need to see to fight corruption. Without further ado, I see my panelists, I'm very excited, are coming on screen. What we're going to try to get through in this half hour is, of course, to discuss the Trust in Congress Act, but also other critical pathways for making it harder for members of Congress and senior government officials to abuse their office for private gain. And more generally, how what kinds of fixes and pathways might really help sort of create a Congress or a federal government that is worthy of our trust, that can earn our trust back. So that's going to be the crux of the conversation. Very excited now to introduce our panelists. We have Kimberly Leonard. Kimberly Leonard has been a journalist for over a decade and is a policy and politics correspondent for Insider. Insider's was formerly known as Business Insider. And she writes about campaigns, money in politics, key decision makers, and how policy affects people. And we want to congratulate her on her recent move to Miami, where she will be covering Florida's governance race and the midterms and all the buzz around the 2024 presidential election, for which we wish her great fortitude. We have Dr. Ron Hira, Associate Professor of Political Science at Howard University, the prestigious HBCU in Washington, D.C. Ron teaches public policy and public administration, where he incorporates ethics into the classroom by drawing on his own policy experience. And Ron, much like myself, believe that money's influence in shaping actual public policies is under-examined in both textbooks and academic scholarships. We're really thrilled to have Ron here. And finally, last but of course not least, we have Walt Shaub, our Senior Ethics Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight, which we affectionately refer to as POGO, and former director of the U.S. Office of Government Ethics. So let's get into it. I want to set the stage. We've talked about the decline of public trust, but I really want us to share several data points that sort of confirm that Americans have steadily lost trust in our public institutions in conjunction with worsening perceptions of corruption in federal government. So when the National Election Study first started tracking the public's level of trust in government back in 1958, about 3/4 of the American public trusted government to do the right thing, almost always or most of the time. Since 2007, however, the share of Americans having that level of trust in government has not surpassed 30%. Now, as of May this year, 36% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents say that they can trust government, compared with 9% of Republicans and Republican leaners. Now, these numbers are virtually the inverse by party of what they were under Trump's administration. And while, as far as I know, data regarding perceptions of corruption in the US have not been systematically tracked as far back as the 50s, thanks to the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, we can say that perceptions held by policy experts working in or on the US regarding levels of US government corruption have worsened over the past 9 years at least. So it should be of no surprise when POGO published the results of our survey of voters in Michigan and Ohio this Tuesday, that survey found that more voters from both of these swing states see government corruption as a very big problem than they do any other issue. So that more voters said corruption is the very big issue than they said the same about crime, COVID, healthcare, or climate change, among other issues. So I'm going to quote from my colleague Brandon's analysis of that data, which shows, quote, a striking majority across both states, 81%, agree that corruption is widespread throughout the federal government. What's more, those voters also believe that corruption in the federal government is getting worse. Nearly 3/4 of participants across both states, 73%, say corruption in the federal government has increased over the last 10 years. When asked whether corruption has increased, decreased, or stayed about the same in 2021, 57% said corruption has continued to increase, and 24% has say that it has stayed the same, which, if anything, suggests that the anti-corruption platform that Biden came in on is not hitting home. And we do hope that the White House administration takes very seriously that efforts, either real or perceived, to tackle these issues are not hitting home in critical swing states. So with these very sort of daunting numbers in mind, and recognizing there's a difference between perception and reality, we can get into that. I really want to open my first question to Kimberly. Kimberly, in your reporting on Congress, what examples have you seen that you think might fuel this loss of trust?
I've seen a lot of examples. With our reporting in particular, we've been focused on members of Congress and how, they invest their money and how they're not being transparent and how they do it. A lot of members are late. We've had 37 instances of members of Congress who failed to properly disclose their stock trades, even though it's required under federal law. And from what I can tell, there's not a lot of enforcement of the rule. And, we've also done stories on, I did a story on members of Congress and how they go on privately funded travel and how during those trips, they're not necessarily doing business work. They're more treating them like vacations. So, I do definitely resonate with a lot of the comments that were made earlier in this panel, where when I talk to people or when I write stories, often the reaction is, well, of course, there it goes again, as if, I shouldn't report on it because it should just be expected. And so that's certainly a pattern that I've noticed as I've taken on more reporting about money in politics and conflict of interest, and just the juxtaposition between, what politicians say they believe in and what they claim to be all about versus, examples of actions that conflict with that stated position.
And I am going to want us to touch some more on that sort of reaction that you hear so often from Americans. And I think it really, what it suggests is if you think that they're all corrupt, then you're going to make choices that aren't about affecting change, but are about, voting for the guy who says most what you want to hear, right? And I think there's a danger to that. And so I'm going to like flip to you, Walt, as someone who has been working on ethics issues for quite some time within government. How seriously do you think the problem is? How much of this is reality and perception? Are things getting better, worse? What's your take?
You know, I think we're in an unfortunate time where partisanship is so strong that you have to sort of separate people's partisan views from the reality of actual corruption or actual perception of corruption. You know, if one party views the other party's policy platforms as inherently corrupt, then they're going to be corrupt about, you know, suspicious of government. But I think that we've had enough instances of ethical failure that then stokes that suspicion even more. And so I don't know how we get back to a high level of trust in government as long as our country is so polarized. But I do know how we can get back to more trust in government than we have now. And it includes things like this bill that Representative Spanberger has proposed to prevent members of Congress from trading. The list that Insider has been keeping of the number of members of Congress who have violated the Stock Act by not reporting their trades, or who engage in trades that are linked to their activities in Congress are just shocking. It becomes a bit of a comedy routine, as Kimberly said, but it's just really dark comedy. When they enacted the Stock Act in 2012, which created the requirement to report transactions fairly rapidly after they occurred, the thought among many of the sponsors of that bill and their staffs would be that reporting would be so annoying and so burdensome that members of Congress would just stop trading stocks, which was the real goal. Unfortunately, what it appears many of them are doing is just not complying with the requirement, and there isn't much or any enforcement on the Hill. And so I think doing some basic things to tighten up the ethical programs in the government would go a long way to improving public trust in government, even if we can't get to a high level while we're so partisan.
And I want to get back to the question of, should we be focusing more on the enforcement side and really like ramping that up, or do we really need a whole new set of, like, you know, tackle this through the legislative process? Now, Ron, I want to go to you as someone who's worked on government research, both as an academic and on the policy side. How does the survey data and the trends that I pointed to at the beginning mesh with your own research and policy expertise?
Well, thank you for inviting me, Zoe. This is a really important issue, and I want to applaud POGO for shining a light on government corruption. Trading stocks on non-public information is a blatant violation of our core values of fairness, and it erodes public trust. That's really serious because public trust is the foundation of any well-functioning democracy. You know, if you remove that trust, the legitimacy of the government crumbles. But I also want to talk a little bit more about, you know, the public's mistrust, and I think it runs deeper than these particular acts of corruption of stock trading and the like. And you know, the 2016 election really stands out to me as a revelation of some of, you know, the extent of the public's mistrust. You had two outsider candidates, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, who performed a lot better than anyone expected, in part because I think they both tapped into the public sense that the government is rigged. Of course, they did it in different ways. President Trump argued that he was too wealthy to be corruptible, and Senator Sanders raised his money through small donations, which was, you know, pretty remarkable. Nobody expected that to happen. And so I'd like to broaden our conversation to expand beyond sort of the revolving door of public officials, political appointees, and Congress, to include institutions that are really rarely scrutinized and largely unregulated. We all know that when powerful interests seek to influence policy choices, they lobby and make campaign contributions. But these powerful interest groups also capture other key institutions that vet policy ideas. The very institutions entrusted to assess whether a policy proposal is good or bad to advance the public's interest. So you see not just lobbying by powerful interests, but these powerful interests also fund think tanks, they fund academics, they deploy large political communications teams to try to influence media coverage. In today's lexicon, we would say they're trying to influence the influencers. So what do? I think transparency is an important piece here, but it's not a strong enough disinfectant when so much money is out there to be had. And we absolutely need to change the formal rules, by enacting laws like the Trust in Congress Act, and then, of course, enforcing, as Walt said, the Stock Act, which, obviously, if you pass these formal rules, but if you don't enforce them, nothing's going to happen. But really, to change behavior, we need deeper cultural changes. Behavior is shaped not just by formal rules, but also by norms. And since there's always ways to get around formal rules, we need to also focus some of our efforts on changing people's norms. I think that's a lot more difficult to do, but it's why we should be having these discussions and sort of expanding beyond just the formal rules.
Thanks, Ron. It sort of makes me want to go back to you, Kimberly, about sort of, have you seen sort of instances where getting the story out has created enough sort of social shaming that it helped redirect the equation in Congress? Have you seen?
I'm smiling because, it depends who you write it about. I mean, if it's about a Democrat who messed up, then you have all the, Republican social media accounts retweeting those stories and sharing them out, and, vice versa if it's Republicans who do it. So, we've seen that pattern sort of, in terms of the traffic that we get and the attention that stories get and things like that. I will say that I have not seen instances where there's been a lot of enforcement of these rules. It's sort of just like, meh, okay. It's like, sorry you were late. And I haven't been able to find instances of people paying fines. You have to report your stock trades within 30 to 45 days, depending on when you learned about the stock trade. And then you have another 30 days before you have to pay the fine. We haven't seen that enforced really. I have seen fines enforced about people who don't wear masks on the House floor, and that's not federal law. So no, I would say that there's not a whole lot of teeth attached to these rules. I will say also that we're doing a lot of reporting at Insider about violations of the Stock Act, and we have a big project coming later this year that'll go even deeper on that. And as a journalist, there are definitely ways that I think the law could improve, mainly having to do with transparency, because it's difficult to access these records. It's incredibly cumbersome. I have to look every single day. There's no way for me to search directly whether a particular member of Congress invested in a particular stock. It's really hard to find out who does what, because you have to look at each person and look at the trades and do it over time. And y'all can look at the website. It's just kind of a mess. And it was purposefully made to be annoying like that, because the way the law was initially written was that it would be searchable, downloadable, that things would be easy to find, and that's not what we have today.
What's your response to that, Walt? Will the Trust in Congress Act help get us a bit further on these issues? Or, I mean, it's obviously not a panacea to this whole suite of problems of undue influence and abuse of, office for private gain.
It certainly won't address conflicts of interest, but right now the burning concern is this appearance of trading on insider information and this failure to report transactions in a timely fashion. And I think that is something the bill will absolutely address and frankly solve. So I'm really hopeful about this bill, at least preventing this sort of rash of trading related to their activities. I just want to really quickly point out something Ron said, I'm really excited about. I agree wholeheartedly with the comment that you need norms and laws. And I think norms got a bad rap in the last 4 years because President Trump just blew right through them. But laws weren't much more effective. We saw Kellyanne Conway repeatedly violating the Hatch Act and the president refusing to enforce it against her. And so you have to have both. And I think people need to remember that, because right now we're frustrated that Congress hasn't passed a lot of reform addressing the kinds of weaknesses that have been exposed. I'm very excited that this bill, if it gains some traction, will do some good in Congress. But we can't sit back and think, well, we did our jobs as citizens by electing some people and sending them to Washington, and they created a few legislative fixes. We have to restore and actually strengthen norms, because what we've learned is at the top level of government, laws are only as good as the people who enforce them. And so this is where I think citizens have an active role to play in reshaping the expectations. President Trump was dissuaded from holding the G7 conference at his own private resort because the public reacted with such outrage that it scared some senators from Trump's own party, and they called him and told him to knock it off. And that's an example in one isolated case of how the public can affect government behavior. But when you look at what motivated those senators to make that call, it was the perception expressed by an outraged public, including people on their own side, that some line had been crossed. And if we can create pressure at the public level on our leaders, that's what they're going to care about. They're not going to care about a $200 late fee for a financial disclosure form, but they're going to care if they sense that the public is truly focused on corruption and has higher expectations. And that's where these norms come from.
I think that what's challenging about what you just said, if I'm going to draw on the survey we just did in Michigan and Ohio, we can show that these swing state voters absolutely see this as, as my colleague calls it, public enemy number one. Now, the real question then is the second part of your suggestion, which is how to get folks to feel like it's worth their time to engage and to pressure their elected officials on these issues. Because on the one hand, they feel frustrated, they feel lost, they feel like, if the whole system is so rotten, how on God's earth can I make a change? Which I don't actually think is accurate, but it is a very real feeling. And on the other hand, you're hearing from people on the Hill that, we're not hearing from our constituents that they're really interested in these sort of good government reforms. And so I guess, it's so critical what you're saying. And I think there's a real opportunity, a growth opportunity to increase that leverage, which is why I'm going to encourage you all to become a POGO advocate who are listening in the audience. Just click on that green button. But in reality, I think that's the real challenge, is getting people to think that it might be worth their effort to feel like actually they own this government. And if the government is rotten, they have actual power to change it. And it's not just through voting, it's through a real engagement on these issues. Yeah. And I'm just wondering if any of you have seen sort of powerful instances of that. I think the example you just gave about the hotel for the G7 was an excellent one. I'm wondering, Kimberly, if in the back of your mind, you're sort of also measuring that against the hundreds of articles that you've published on this issue, which, didn't have that sort of impact. Where do you see the channels for reform? Like for getting people engaged? Or is that my job? That might be my job.
Kim, you're on mute.
Yeah, I didn't press mute. I think I was muted. So first of all, the way we've been kind of writing them has been this, trickling of news stories that we've been doing. But what we have planned is a sort of saturation of stories that we'll be doing later this year that look at a lot of these instances that go a lot deeper than some of the things that we're talking about, that are really detailed, data-oriented stories. And I can't really share more than that. But, I can say that the initial Stock Act passed because 60 Minutes did an expose. There were government reform advocates who were working on it for years, particularly over at Public Citizen. And it wasn't until that media expose that there was finally the momentum behind making changes. So, I think that's a lot of us get into journalism because we want to do work that has, some sort of public impact. Changing a law is a big deal, obviously. But, so we're gonna put it all out there, and yeah, that's really all I can say about it now. But it's going to be a massive project looking at stock trades.
Well, let's absolutely talk and be ready to help lift that up and promote some solutions in the wake of that research. I'm going to have one more question for Ron, one more for Walt, and then I'm going to pull from some of the audience questions. Cognizant that we're almost over time, we can stay on until 3:35. Is that right? Do any of you? It'll be a sharp 3:35, just so I can get to some of the questions. Ron, you're basically training our next generation. How seriously are you seeing your students sort of engage on these issues, and how can sort of the nonprofits of the world and the academics of the world be better support to students who really want to engage on this? And how lit up are they by these issues, or are they somewhere else?
Well, I try to integrate in my practical experience on policy, and I've been active in a number of different areas. And to be frank, I've had lots of cases where shaming was not enough to change behavior, right? In a few of my areas. But what I find is that our textbook materials that we use, in the classroom is not sufficient. And so I use, lobbying disclosure data, those kinds of things. But I really do emphasize, following the money and give students sort of a practical sense of things. How do you change the morals and the ethics of individuals? I think that's challenging, but I think you raise these as, hey, it can be done. You want to give them an opportunity to see that things could be different. They don't have to be the way they are. And so groups like POGO, other good government groups are really important because, hey, there are people out there advocating for a different path, right? For a different way. And I think that's important for the students to at least be aware. And of course, I give them my sermons about, you try to do the right thing, but it's going to be up to them. And these will be the next generation of Hill staffers and members of Congress. And the vice president, of course, is a Howard alum. So they can make that difference there.
Yeah. Walter, so what would you like to see? I know we talked about we all need better enforcement, but what other sort of legislative or policy fixes are in the works that you're the most excited about?
I think the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which reins in some of the power of the president, is incredibly important. Unfortunately, even in this administration, as with all administrations in the last century, the president is working to expand presidential power at the expense of congressional power. And that's going to be that much more power that will have been amassed for the next authoritarian leaning president who comes in. And the Protecting Our Democracy Act is Congress's effort to seize back some of the power and stop that trend in that direction. I think this Trust in Government Act that Representative Spanberger has proposed is helpful. And I think the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Act are absolutely crucial to the survival of democracy. And I just think that there are lessons, and I'm not optimistic, but I'll say if I had a magic wand, I would want both former President Trump and current President Biden to learn the right lessons of the public's reaction to the perception and reality of corruption. President Trump likely lost in part because of the government's handling of the pandemic, but also the perception of corruption was a big part of what motivated people to get out there. And President Biden ran on a platform of anti-corruption reform. And if you look back at his democracy platform, it was all about legislation for ethics and voting rights and other things. and he's lost interest in them. And so if President Trump could learn a lesson that being corrupt was bad and reinvent himself as not corrupt and not authoritarian, and if President Biden could find that inspiration that he had when he was running and had a platform that touted reform and regain an interest in that, I think both of these individuals would have learned the right lessons. Sadly, I'm not hopeful in either case, but I think the hope comes from the public pressure. And I think the public needs to put significant pressure on the Senate and on the president to advocate for the passage of the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Act, the Protecting Our Democracy Act, and the Trust in Government Act in particular, among other reforms.
Thanks, Walt. I'm going to try and get through the next two questions in 1 minute each, and then we're going to have a wrap up. So I have a question from, I'm going to take the top two questions, starting with the question from Von Hausman. How do you think we should get money out of politics and severely limit the power of corporate lobbyists? And he really requests, please, no generic canned answers. So I'm going to give that one to you, Walt.
Sure. Well, that's a tall order not to do a generic canned answer with the clock ticking and the bright lights on. But I think we absolutely have to, in the short term, shine the light on dark money and require more disclosure of who's making campaign contributions. I'd like to see better limits. I would love to see a constitutional amendment overruling Citizens United and saying that corporations are not people and don't have a right to donate. Basically, all of the things that were in the For the People Act on the campaign finance reform front that were gutted would also take us a long way towards getting money out of politics. And I think, unfortunately, politics makes some strange bedfellows. And so you have some far-right groups and you have the ACLU championing the idea that money is free speech and that there shouldn't be any limits. And the ACLU has even taken the position that Citizens United was a good thing. And I think what that ignores, it's a vision of free speech, of the marketplace of ideas, that the best ideas will just float to the top. But what that ignores is that some people have a much bigger megaphone, and their freedom is the freedom to drown out everyone else's voice. And when it comes to the fundamental structure of democracy, which is the ability to vote and the ability to hear the candidates that you're choosing, I think that allowing big money in government drowns out other ideas. And it isn't always the best ideas. It's the ideas backed by the loudest, most expensive megaphones. And so I would like to see all of these types of measures to get money out of politics. So I can't promise that wasn't a canned response, because I feel this strongly and have said it often, but it's certainly, I think, the steps we need to take.
Kimberly, for some reason, I think you wanted to add to that. Am I reading your body language?
No,
correctly?
no, I was just,
okay.
I crashed a fundraiser yesterday with a lot of wealthy donors, and so I'm just sort of listening and nodding along. So yes, I see that for sure. See the influence.
So we have 1 minute left, and then the question is: would someone speak about military spending as more for high profits than practical defense? And I am going to use my prerogative as moderator to say we are not going to address this question today, but it is a question that POGO really has spent decades working on. The undue influence of defense contractors over our defense spending is well documented by POGO and our partners, and there are a lot of things we are trying to do about that. So I really recommend folks who care about that issue and want to take action to go to our website. Right next to the POGO is a Take Action button, and go to the issues for defense and waste and fraud and corruption. And we will be working with you on that. And as someone who has worked with people who have fought corruption in Guatemala, Venezuela, Eastern Europe, I just really want to say that while the sense of being overwhelmed is definitely challenging at times, I have seen real reform happen in places where the challenges and the stakes were really life and death every day. And what really makes a difference is that citizen engagement, exactly the kind of thing Walt was talking about, but it starts incrementally. It's like the small pieces where you can make a change. And, you know, starting to win a few battles in the war against corruption, which will be forever, but will be well worth fighting. So I really want to thank my panelists. You guys are great. I wish I had another hour to talk with you. I'm really looking forward to what your team is coming up with, Kimberly, on the Stock Act, and working with Ron and his students. And Walt, I get to work with you every day, so I'm very happy about that. So have a great day, everyone. And again, thanks so much, everyone.